All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's program. My name is Natalie Haran. I am Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of Houston School of Art, and I am so delighted you have decided to join us for part 2 in our series, Interrogating Global Contemporary Art, Research, Pedagogy, Museums. This series reflects the intellectual investments of our faculty and of the graduate students in our MA in Art History program, now proudly celebrating its 10th year. It complements the work our students do in the classroom, as well as the many paid internships and instructional assistantships they hold that amplify their studies. Now, Houston is the most diverse city in the nation, and as such, my colleagues, Sandra Zalman and Dorota Beachel, and I were conceiving this convening, and we felt the particular urgency of addressing the global contemporary right here in Houston, which makes today's guests particularly relevant to our conversations. Thinking locally about the implications of the global, we are not here merely to celebrate the global contemporary, of course, but to critically interrogate its emergence, its influence, and its implications for the future of our work as researchers, teachers, and curators. We want to ask, what is global contemporary art and how is it remaking approaches to artistic practice, scholarship, and curation? In a moment of cultural reckoning that has rendered past efforts at diversifying and expanding our canon insufficient, how can the call and the idea of global contemporary art help us to critically and ethically engage in the reconstruction of a historically exclusive discipline? And as academic programs and museums adopt this rhetoric of global contemporary art, along with its weaknesses and blind spots, we must admit, is global contemporary art as a paradigm, as an idea here to stay? So back in 2019, in a pre-COVID world, we originally conceived these events as a one-day in-person intensive convening. And we were grateful at that time to receive support from the University of Houston Division of Research and support from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and Blaffer Art Museum as organizational partners. However, beneficially, circumstances now allow for us to have a go at a truly global conversation. So we're to be able to take advantage of our new digital circumstances to expand the dialogue and invite you all into the fold. So we invite you to enter your questions in the chat window at any time during today's program. And after our distinguished guest, Mary Carmen Ramírez, after her remarks, we will get to as many audience questions as time allows before we end promptly at 4:30 Central Time. If you'd like to ask your question verbally, please raise your hand during the Q&A. We will call on you and you will see a window inviting you to unmute yourself and speak. My colleague Sandra Zalman will be monitoring the chat and helping Dorota Beachel, who's serving as our respondent today, field all of your questions. And we do have a healthy amount of time for dialogue, so please do raise your voice. So my colleague Sandra will be monitoring the chat. And now I'm very happy to pass the virtual microphone to my colleague, postdoctoral fellow Dorota Beachel, who will introduce our esteemed speaker, Mary Carmen Ramírez. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Hello, everyone. It's really great to see you all here. It's great to see people whom I know. It's great to see people whom I know through your writing, and it's great to see your new faces. So welcome everyone to this virtual meeting space that we have created. It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Mari Carmen Ramírez. Mari Carmen is the Wortham Curator of Latin American Art and founding director of the International Center for the Arts of the Americas, ICAA, at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Prior to that, she was curator of Latin American art at the Jack S. Blanton Museum of Art and adjunct lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History, both at the University of Texas at Austin. Ramírez also served as director of the Museo de Antropología, Historia y Arte de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. She received a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago in 1989. Ramírez has curated numerous exhibitions of Latin American art, including Inverted Utopias, Avant-Garde Art in Latin America, which took place at the Museum of Fine Arts in 2004, which was co-curated with Vector Olea. This exhibition was recognized by the International Association of Art Critics as the best thematic museum show nationally in the United States. New York Times art critic Holland Cotter declared Inverted Utopias one of the most important exhibitions of the decade. In his words, the exhibition, quote, threw open a treasure chest of work by dozens of exciting, mind-altering, history-changing artists, some 90% of whom were unknown outside of their countries of origin. End quote. That's Holland Cotter. I just want to say that as someone who teaches Latin American art, I continuously refer to that catalog. It's been invaluable support to my work. At the ICAA, Ramírez conceptualized and oversees the Continental Initiative Documents of the 20th Century Latin American and Latino Art, a digital archive and publications project consisting of the recovery and the digitalization of primary sources related to the artistic production of the region. She was awarded numerous awards, including Award for Curatorial Excellence from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in 2005. The same year, Time magazine named her one of the 25 most influential Hispanics in America. She is also the recipient of the 2014 Latino Influencer Award. And that same year, she has made the list of the 100 most powerful women in the arts. Mari Carmen has published widely on a broad range of topics, such as the relationship of Latin American art to identity politics, multiculturalism, globalization, and curatorial practice. So I just want to point to a very long trajectory that had started with 1992 publication of the essay called Beyond the Fantastic, Framing Identity in the US Exhibition of Latin American Art, which I really think shook up the field and set the trajectory of thinking about power relations involved in the exhibition making that encompasses geographic monikers. That has been essential to Mari Carmen's work. And again, as someone who works in the field, her contributions has been indispensable and foundational to all my own work. So without further ado and much gratitude, I look forward to you taking the temperature of the field right now in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorota, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you to Sandra, Salma, and Natalie Haren, and to you, Dorota, for the invitation to be here with all of you today. And thank you to everyone who has zoomed in to be part of this conversation. It's a great pleasure to be sharing these insights with you today. The present talk is part of an ongoing investigation about the meaning and approaches to contemporary art in the field of Latin American art that began with the research I undertook for the exhibition project's Contingent Beauty, Contemporary Art in Latin America that took place in 2015 at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and Home, So Different, So Appealing for LACMA and the MFAH in 2017. As with every other subject that I have tackled over the last 35 years, it brings together theoretical concerns that emerge from my training as an art historian with concrete issues grounded in curatorial practice. It is precisely the straddling back and forth between theory and practice that provides the key to the insights I would like to share with you today. And now if I can share my screen. Sorry, I should have shared before. I will first address the notion of the contemporary. Since the 1980s, the field that, for lack of a better term, we refer to as Latin American art has evolved drastically. beginning as a mere descriptor of their underappreciated visual arts expression of a marginal region. This construct has become synonymous with a vibrant and steadily expanding area of visual arts production, collecting, and curatorial practice. Such an area encompasses more than 18 countries from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego, as well as a vast array of races, ethnicities, nationalities, and genders. Also included in this construct are a plethora of globally dispersed diasporic communities, whose continuous and ongoing movements are hard to track. Moreover, the ubiquitous presence of artists from Central, South America, and the Caribbean in exhibition circuits and institutional collections worldwide suggests that these dynamic developments are finally producing the long-awaited legitimization of Latin American art as a market, exhibition, and collecting phenomenon at the global level. At the kernel of these transformations is the move away from forms of artistic expression obsessively anchored on notions of cultural identity, which dominated the visual arts production of this geopolitical enclave throughout most of the 20th century. Instead, there is the embrace of what art historian Terry Smith and others have referred to as the contemporary. Such a term broadly designates more than the demise of the modern that preceded it. More accurately, it signals the rise and consolidation of a new paradigm that resulted from the ascent of globalization as the hegemonic world order after 1980. In line with a presumed erasure of nation-state borders and the dissolution of nationalisms brought about by globalizing processes, the term appears to stand for an art seemingly devoid of a historic past or an overriding style. One that in its very neutrality and heterogeneity seems free of historical determination and critical judgment. From this point of view, the contemporary can be considered a sort of permanent state of the now. That is, a form of eternal present, capable of speaking to us directly about our own experience of living in the present time. Unlike the fixed stylistic and elite-based hierarchies favored by modernism, the contemporary is also an art that promotes stylistic plurality as well as ethnic and cultural diversity. In Smith's words, and I quote, "Contemporary art is, perhaps for the first time in history, truly an art of the world. It comes from the whole world and frequently tries to imagine the world as a differentiated yet connected whole," end of quote. Completing this view of the contemporary as a truly global paradigm is the economic, industrial, and institutional complex that holds it in place. Indeed, the contemporary signals a realignment of the infrastructure, circuits, and hierarchies that held artistic practices in place during the first 3/4 of the 20th century. This dynamic began to take shape in the 1990s, only to emerge in full force with the new millennium. In overt opposition to the centrifugal center-periphery axis that guided the dissemination of modern art, the contemporary, in turn, relies on an ever-expanding and interconnected horizontal network of artists, curators, collectors, galleries, and markets. These agents are responsible for proactively and indiscriminately circulating its practices to all corners of the planet. To this must be added another special feature of the contemporary. Unlike modernism, it succeeded in breaking down artistic and class barriers, merging high and low culture, fashion, entertainment, and spectacle in a way that strongly appeals to mass audiences. As Cuauhtémoc Medina observes, this feature is a signal that, and I quote, modern capitalist society finally has an art that aligns with the audience, with the social elites that finance it, and with the academic industry that serves as its fellow traveler. In this sense, art has become literally contemporary, end of quote. Indeed, a paradoxical aspect of this process is the way in which such a paragon of the now and the present has also become institutionalized. That is, it's become fixed in its own right, both in museums and academia worldwide. Not only has there been an explosion of contemporary art museums and Kunsthalles all over the planet, but even venerable encyclopedic museums are seeking to shake off the dust and ride the fast forward trend by building annexes, opening curatorial departments, and incorporating curators to their staff. Outstanding examples include the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who only 10, 15 years ago had nothing to do with contemporary art, basically, the Art Institute of Chicago, and my own Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which is in the process of opening a brand new building dedicated to 20th and 21st century art. In tandem with these developments, specialized academic programs with dedicated professorships have sprung up everywhere. Indeed, by some estimates, the study of contemporary art has become the fastest growing subject area in the academy since the turn of the millennium. As a result, contemporary art enjoys more visibility and currency today than it has had at any other time in history. This is a truly remarkable accomplishment when we consider how many decades it took for avant-garde and other 20th century cutting-edge manifestations to be assimilated into the museum and academic establishment in the past. And of course, not to give away my age, but when I was studying, we were not allowed to study art post-1945. I mean, that's where everything ended. Studying contemporary art supposedly did not have the perspective, we did not have the perspective to be able to address the art of the present. Clearly, the ascent of Latin American artistic practices in global markets and exhibition circuits over the last 3 decades has gone hand in hand with the parallel rise of the contemporary at both the ideological and systemic levels. From a formal point of view, perhaps the most salient indicator of this shift is the fact that the art produced in the region is, on the surface at least, not unlike that produced anywhere else in the globalized world. Operating for the most part within the legacies of the neutral lingua franca of minimalism, post-conceptualism, technology, and new media, these works initially conceal their cultural identity to the viewer. From this point of view, I would argue that one of the most beneficial aspects of the aforementioned transformations has been the almost complete eradication of the widespread distortions and market-driven stereotypes that until very recently characterized the display and interpretation of Latin American art in the United States and Europe. That is, what I have elsewhere referred to as the fantastic. By contrast, the degree of success and acceptance achieved by contemporary practices over the last 3 decades absolutely precludes this type of grotesque characterization today. To this must be added 2 additional markers: the significant expansion of the existing knowledge base about this art through exhibitions, academic programs, and publications, and the extent to which artists from the region, such as Elio Itisica, Lygia Clark, Gego, who will be the subject of a major retrospective at the Guggenheim, Tate Modern, and several other major museums very soon, Jesus Soto, Doris Salcedo, Gabriel Orozco, and others, the extent to which all of these artists from Latin America that were hardly known 20 years ago are currently being mainstreamed. On the negative side, however, the assimilation of the contemporary has given rise to yet another set of misinterpretations, as well as a host of critical questions. I refer to the frequently invoked view that the art produced in Latin American countries has not only transcended its peripheral status, but also shed its cultural specificity, thus becoming yet another neutral manifestation of so-called global contemporary art. Peruvian curator Jose Falconi gives voice to this type of triumphalist and gullible perspective when he states, and I quote, "For Latin Americans, the emergence of a new temporal paradigm was particularly liberating. The erasure of boundaries between peripheral areas and metropolitan centers established the potential for the region's cultural production to equal that of traditional centers of discourse in Europe and the United States. In fact, precisely because it implied leaving behind a modernist paradigm for which Latin Americans always felt unfit, inadequate, and late, they have been eager to embrace it as a legitimizing proof of their global cultural status," end of quote. The limitations of this point of view become evident when we consider that in the case of Latin America, 3 centuries of colonial domination by European nations placed this New World geopolitical bloc on unequal footing vis-a-vis the metropolis. This meant that the cultural exchange between the European centers and Latin American peripheries was always from there to here, and not the other way around. In this context, political independence did not necessarily bring with it economic independence, a fact that to this day continues to tie the destinies of these nations to hegemonic decision-making North Atlantic powers. By contrast, the rise of the contemporary, at least as a concept or as a construct, presumes an automatic leveling of the uneven playing field in which Latin American art has been inscribed. That is, like the failed promises of cosmopolitanism and internationalism that took hold of the Latin American avant-gardes in the 1920s and 60s, such a view would be promoting the illusion that the gap separating these manifestations from those of the centers has been closed overnight. Such a position indeed leads me to pose the following questions. Are artists in Latin America merely following a global fad, or are they actively contributing to it? To what extent, as Falconi and others wishfully claim, has this art transcended its peripheral status and cultural specificity to become yet another manifestation of global contemporary art? Have these practices truly shed concerns with identity, or have they reformulated it? And last but not least, as theoretician Roberto Schwartz points out, and I quote, "Can we detect here a shift whereby instead of a longing for Europeanization or Americanization, we are finally witnessing an inversion that Latin Americanizes the central cultures," end of quote. In order to answer these questions, we must look closely at traits of the contemporary and how they play out in the Latin American context. Before doing so, however, I would like to turn your attention to some of the historical and political factors, as well as contradictions that serve to ground the rise of the contemporary in this subcontinent, while at the same time distinguishing it from other emerging geopolitical enclaves outside the hegemonic North Atlantic axis. It is important to keep in mind in this regard that while Latin America is usually grouped with Asia and Africa in discussions of the post-colonial contemporary, and indeed shares with these regions many of the features and processes of post-coloniality, its situation differs substantially from them on account of its direct, if problematic and subordinate, relationship to the hegemonic West. This relationship is based both on identity as well as otherness or difference. Moreover, Spanish rule in the colonies not only decimated indigenous populations, but created viceroyalties that in one way or another closely replicated metropolitan life and culture in all areas under their purview. For this reason, in the view of some scholars, Latin American culture could be considered not completely alien, but rather an alternate form of Western culture. In this context, the persistence until today of the unequal axis of exchange to which I alluded at the beginning of this talk explains what Cuban critic and curator Gerardo Mosquera calls the neurosis of identity that has obsessively dominated the cyclical debates about arts and culture of this region from the colonial epoch to current times. While the conditions supporting this chronic concern have changed, the roots of the problem have concrete historical basis. The origins of this neurosis hark back to the nation-building project of the early decades of the 20th century. Then the arduous task of consolidating heterogeneous classes and ethnic groups into national states went hand in hand with the articulation of visual motifs through which to coalesce and ultimately impose a particular notion of collective identity, which was promoted and exemplified in a paradigmatic way by Mexican muralism. In this hopeful context, artists responded to the overall mission entrusted to their generation by focusing on recognizable emblems grounded in landscape, native types, or even vernacular traditions of their respective countries. They did so, however, by assimilating or rather cannibalizing and then subverting the language of the European avant-gardes, a process that Hector Olea and I coined inverted utopias. The trends towards forging independent cultures as part of a nation-building project continued into the 1960s. For artists emerging in that decade, becoming international, or in that time, the equivalent of contemporary, did not necessarily involve embracing vernacular markers of identity, but rather critically embracing an experimental melting pot of traditions, both local and foreign. Such a trend is nowhere better exemplified than in the iconoclastic production of Colombian Beatriz González, who appropriated images associated with Western art history and mass media in her native Colombia and recycled them in furniture and everyday objects. Declaring herself a provincial painter, González called into question the subordinate relationship between marginal localities such as Colombia and the dominant centers of artistic and cultural production represented by Europe and the United States. Her objective, however, went beyond a simple critique of representation toward a broader assessment of the state of culture in her homeland and its relationship to the persistent legacy of colonialism. The ascent of the contemporary in Latin American art over the last 30 years, in turn, is a result of political and economic changes throughout the region that significantly altered the conditions in which the identity paradigm operated. Among them, we can cite the return to democracy that took place beginning in 1982 in major countries that included Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. After decades of repression and marginalization from the international scene, the democratic aperture not only facilitated cultural exchange, but also provided access, for the first time in many cases, to the work of largely unknown avant-garde artisan groups. This was the case of concrete and constructive art, as represented in the Lerner collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, or of Kosice's Hydrospatial City, which will soon be displayed and will be in the permanent displayed in the new building, as well as ideological conceptualism represented by Sildo Meireles' by now very well-known Coca-Cola bottles with the insertions into ideological circuits. These are all movements in which Latin Americans not only played pioneering roles, but they also contributed original theory. The exchanges that ensued from access to this treasure trove produced a plethora of exhibitions and publications, exemplified by Lynn Zelevansky's Beyond Geometry Experiments in Form at LACMA in 2004, and our own Inverted Utopias, Avant-Garde Art in Latin America at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2004. Both of these exhibitions set out to debunk the prevailing reductive view of Latin American art by shifting the attention away from the cited stereotypes to outstanding examples of the experimental, artistic, and theoretical production throughout the region. The adoption of neoliberalism as an economic doctrine and the activation of financial circuits between the US and Latin America that resulted from globalization stimulated and facilitated the entrance of local bourgeoisies and cultural agents, such as curators, into the ranks of the global elites for the purposes of exchanging financial and symbolic capital. The purpose of brokering identities, as I coined it in a 1994 essay, led to the overhauling or outright establishment of infrastructures for contemporary art in cities that until very recently lacked any kind of spaces for this art. Such urban centers encompass a broad range, from major metropolis like Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, to off-the-chart capitals like Lima, San Juan, San Salvador, and Guatemala City. The transnational shift stimulated by neoliberalism also facilitated the consolidation of an active art market and exhibition infrastructure that not only includes international biennials, but above all, the proliferation of art fairs and artist-run spaces in the region. Artist-run spaces in particular deserve a lot of attention because these very sometimes precarious institutions like Beta Local in San Juan, Casa Tres Patios Medellin, or Flora Arts Natura in Bogota have undertaken the function of showing and promoting contemporary art, and as well as promoting active exchanges of artists and agents in places where governments and museums had stopped doing that. And so they have really filled in a gap that has contributed to activating the presence of local artists in international circuits at the same time that they expose locals to what is happening in the international or global art circuits. In tandem with all these developments, more and more Latin American artists began to exhibit worldwide and to shuttle back and forth between their countries and global centers, a dynamic that contributed to the deceiving perception that Latin American art had finally arrived, had finally made it, in the sense that it had transcended its endemic marginalization from the centers. Such phenomena open up the way for the full-fledged ascent of contemporary artistic practices from Latin America in global circuits since the 1990s, exemplified by the almost instantaneous rise in recognition of artists like Doris Salcedo, Guillermo Cuitca, Sildo Meireles, or Teresa Margolles, and many others. Like those associated with nationalism or the fantastic, this new generation did not feel obliged, nor were they forced to carry identity under labels. Seemingly liberated from the weight of colonialism, they emerged into the international scene simply as artists. Such an unprecedented situation led Gerardo Mosquera to observe in the mid-1990s that, I quote, "Latin American art has ceased to be so and has instead become art from Latin America," end of quote. And yet, as outlined at the beginning of this talk, the question remains, to what extent are Latin American artistic practices fully renouncing notions of identity in their pursuit of the contemporary? Is it possible to attain full parity in the newly recontextualized and reimagined world of the perennial present? To what extent has the imbalance of power I described earlier ceased to be relevant? Considering the intrinsic pluralism and multifariousness that characterizes art practices today, which Ms. has characterized as unpredictable and diverse as contemporaneity itself, the attempt to pin down the cultural specificity or identity of any contemporary art from Latin America would appear as a futile, if not fallacious, exercise. And yet, rather than the triumphal parity advocated by Falconi and others, this impasse suggests the need to reframe the positions at stake in the dialectical relationship between Latin American art and the contemporary. That is, to the extent that the ever-expansive network of biennales, fairs, and art museums has leveled the temporal and geographic conditions for the exhibition and dissemination of this art globally, it has also allowed these practices to actively participate in the very constitution of the contemporary in real time. This factor not only puts to rest the notion that Latin American art was always temporally lagging with regards to the centrally generated movements, but adds a new productive dimension to this debate. Rather than being swallowed by contemporary art's indeterminate pluralism, artists from Latin America are contributing to transform the restrictive parameters of hegemonic art into an active plurality. For Mosquera, this dynamic entails working within the parameters of the new international lingua francas, while at the same time expanding its capacity for dense and refined meaning in order to deal with the complexities of societies and cultures where multiplicity, hybridization, contrast, and chaos have introduced contradictions as well as subtleties. End of quote. This process is nowhere more evident today than in the current reassessment of the work of women or LGBTQ artists, such as was manifest in the very successful and very important historic exhibition, Radical Women, as well as the work of Afro-Latin American and indigenous artists, which until recently were marginalized from discussions about Latin American art. I would argue that despite the conceptual and strategic affinities with other global artistic manifestations, contemporary artists in our continent have developed strategies of meaning grounded in the social and political realities of their countries. And this inevitably differentiates them from their global counterparts, thereby providing a cultural and geographic specificity to the operative notion of the contemporary. And yet, the crucial distinction I am trying to highlight here lies in the fact that these identities begin to manifest themselves more by their features as artistic praxis than by their use of identifying elements or markers taken from vernacular or local culture as a point of departure. In this context, identity has been duly reformulated. Rather than representing something, its signs are embedded in the material or semantic fabric of the work, as well as in its artistic practice. By way of a few examples, the Australia-based Colombian artist Maria Fernanda Cardoso assembles clusters of dried starfish to comment upon the far-flung impact of globalization and speculative urban growth on people and the environment. Proceeding from his own experience growing up in a shantytown, Mexican Abraham Cruz Villegas builds complex installations as well as discrete sculptures from both objects and refuse of familial homes to reenact the tortuous ways in which these communities self-construct their identities. And he's actually developed a fascinating theoretical position called autoconstrucción, or self-construction, which is based on this notion of additive elements that construct the family homes in these shantytowns. Mexican Teresa Serrano resorts to a piñata in the shape of a young woman to produce a powerful indictment on domestic violence against women, particularly women in Ciudad Juárez, that have been the object of femicide for several years now. Miguel Ángel Rojas from Colombia draws attention to drug trafficking with Broadway, 1996, a trail of more than 3,000 coca leaves pinned to the gallery wall, alluding as ants to the laborer farms that grow the plants as a mode of survival. Carmela Gross' monumental black tulle skirt with a hole at the top indicating the torso alludes to the historically subordinate conditions of Black women in Brazilian society since slavery. Guatemalan indigenous artist Manuel Chavallay resorts to video in this work, where he traverses the Atitlan Lake in a canoe, memorializing the conflict amongst indigenous people that created border and frontiers within Guatemala. He initiates the trip dressed in indigenous clothes and returns as a guerrilla fighter. Another Guatemalan, Antonio Pichilla, updates the language of constructive art with abstract motifs and colors from his indigenous culture. Chemi Rosado worked in tandem with residents from Naranjito, a small town in Puerto Rico. His proposal is a painting exercise where the residents become the artists who meld their own houses to the tropical landscape about to disappear by means of urban concrete. Through the strategies described above, contemporary artists from Latin America are trying to redefine the notion of the contemporary beyond an indeterminate eternal present or the financial entertainment mass culture complex. This entails redistributing both the material and symbolic associations conveyed by these objects from their mundane value to the realm of critical, even vitriolic art. Such an experimental reallocation of meaning is made possible by the fact that the poignant choice of ready-mades and everyday materials is already imbued with both personal or collective references, stressing the violence and inequality or other social ills that has by now become a part of life in countries like Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, or Cuba. And you're looking at Joan Capote, stress in memoriam of 2004-2012, which is composed of over 2,000 teeth that he collected from people in Cuba to denote the implications of living in Cuba during the so-called special period. So that in every case, in this case, this is Oscar Munoz with sugar cubes and coffee and images of the disappeared from Colombia's La Violencia. In every case, the artist sets out to rescue a suppressed or forgotten individual or collective history that is directly or indirectly epitomized by these bodily parts or ordinary objects. In the act of gathering them together, he or she brings back to life the subjects of that history, while in the process empowering them as active agents of the political process. This process is not unlike what has happened in other emergent areas of the so-called global South. As Terry Smith acknowledges, in the US and Europe, the contemporary has produced extensions, however critical, of the legacy of modernism. Yet in post-colonial regions such as Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and I quote, the transnational turn has generated a plethora of art shaped by local, national, anti-colonial, and independent values, such as diversity, identity, and critique, end of quote. In the end, this dynamic is not unlike the one that articulated key avant-garde movements in Latin America throughout the 20th century. The difference between then and now, however, is that the global aspirations and capitalist devouring mechanisms of the contemporary have authorized and sanctioned this dynamic as the guiding force, not exactly a principle for artistic practices today. From this point of view, the new horizontal order introduced by the contemporary does not de facto eliminate the unequal axis of exchange that characterizes the relationship of the global South to hegemonic powers. Latin America, as I noted earlier in this talk, produces great art and artists, yet has no authority to legitimize the art of other countries or regions. Its visual arts infrastructure, such as museums, Kunsthalles, archives, patronage, and other legal incentives and publications, is still very weak and riddled with financial and systemic problems. And despite the surge of monographic exhibitions on key artists of the region, made by museums from Latin America as well from Europe and the United States, the pioneering roles of these artists and their theoretical contributions to modernism and postmodernism are still not recognized in textbooks and other publications of 20th century art, 20th or 21st century art. Even Mosquera acknowledges that despite the positive surge of the contemporary in Latin America, our countries have been relegated to the role of supplying artists to the global mall. In this context, only efforts aimed at building or improving existing structures and institutional networks at the local and regional levels can effectively close the existing gap. In this context, and despite the significant gains it has promoted in the field of Latin American art, the contemporary can only be considered a distraction from the real issues at stake. In this context, I will conclude by saying that the contemporary in Latin America can only assume the role of an urgent provocation aimed at rethinking the always contested relationship between artistic practice, theoretical identity, and our contingent present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari Carmen. This was really fantastic, and I bet that we have a lot to talk about. I wanted to point out that Gerardo Mosquera is a wonderful link between your talk and the talk of David Josselet that we had on Thursday, in which David brought this very poignant quote from Gerardo about curating cultures and versus curated cultures, which I think has very much to do with your final closing thoughts of this talk. For everyone who is with us here, we are taking questions for Mari Carmen in two modes. You can either ask them through chat and Sandra will read them out loud to everyone. You are also very welcome to ask them verbally. So to that end, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and we will ask to unmute yourself and speak. At this moment, if you would like to turn on your camera so that we can have some sort of semblance of being in the room together, you are very much welcome to do so. Just please keep in mind that we're recording this talk. So if you show yourself, you're going to be visible in our recording. So hello again. It's nice to see the faces. I see that we already have questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions for you to get us started, Mari Carmen, if I may.
Sure.
I think that one of the points that really struck me from your talk was this thought that I think very much relates to Gerardo's distinction between curated and curating cultures, when you mentioned that institutions in Latin America do not sort of have the legitimizing power over the other parts of the global South that the institutions in the US or the Western Europe might have. Would you like to speak a little bit more to that and the type of dynamics that this phenomenon reveals to us?
Well, sure. Well, I guess we have to start with the fact that in Latin America, there are no private museums like in the United States. Very little private museums. And I'm talking about the field of modern and contemporary art. There could be other exceptions in other areas. But most Latin American countries adopted the French model of state patronage. And so museums have been museums of the state for the most part, or of the cities or municipalities. And so that has thrust these institutions many times into virtual chaos. Whether it's a dictatorship, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's, whatever is happening in the country, has an impact on these institutions. So I would say that the institutional infrastructure, for this art is very weak. We have seen in the last, over the last 2 decades, the emergence of very important institutions like Malba in Buenos Aires. It is one of the very few private museums, but even Malba is struggling. And so there is not what you would expect of many of these institutions, that they would be doing the kinds of exhibitions, retrospectives, publications, focus on these art and artists, and then which provide the basis for projecting them to the outside world. That is happening to a certain extent, but not with the degree that it should be happening, or with the strength that should be happening. So in many cases, these countries rely on museums outside of the countries to identify artists and to do monographic exhibitions, which has happened with most of these artists that I showed, Elio Tisica, Alicia Clark, Gego, etc. This is not to mention that, there have been obviously exhibitions of these artists in these countries, but they don't have the power of projection, to reach beyond the country. So the situation continues. It's like a vicious circle that it's very, very hard to break. So you have a lot of interest on the part of curators and museums outside of these countries, but it's always, the outsider's view, that is coming in to legitimize these artists. And it's very hard for these museums to export, even if they do fantastic shows, which in some cases they have, in many cases they have, it's very hard for them to export those shows. It's very hard for them. There is an incommensurability in terms of how the museum system works in Latin America and how it works in Europe and the United States. And it's frequently impossible to make those two things work. And I say it from completely direct experience. We have done a number of exhibitions that have traveled to some places in Latin America. It's very hard to have shows come from Latin America, even if we want them, even if we're committed to them. The level of logistics and the systems in which these institutions are embedded make it very difficult. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. That's great. I think that there is, again, we could go into the nitty-gritty, but maybe if there is time and space, we will have an opportunity to do that. I think that also what I think is very important, I think for us, especially now in the fall of 2020, is the new sort of reckoning that the institution in the United States are in following George Floyd murder and the ensuing protests, and that it's important to note that this is the dynamics that is not unlike the situation in Latin America. I'm thinking maybe most specifically about Brazil right now and Chile, for example. Do you think that, or I would like to ask, how do you think this exerting pressures on thinking about what equity might mean in the context of the United States and Latin America, how do you think it might change the dynamics of both of institutions in Latin America, especially maybe thinking about differences and similarities between the social movements in the United States and in the US?
That's a very, very topical question. I recently did an interview. Jose Falconi interviewed me precisely about that. I don't have an answer to it because the whole issue of racial equity in Latin America has not been as clear as the debate, let's say, has not been as clear as here in the United States. And I've had conversations in the last, since Black Lives Matter, with some colleagues in Latin America, particularly Mexico, for instance. They feel that what is happening with Black Lives Matter, they completely support it, they understand what is happening, but they feel that that's the reality of the United States, that that's the legacy of slavery, that it's the legacy of the civil rights movement, and that it's a problematic that is intrinsic to the United States. They respect it, they're solidarious with it, but it's someone else's kind of problem. And these are all obviously progressive people. So they're embedded in a different reality. For them, it's more important right now to recover the production of indigenous people, of their own indigenous artists and peoples than, sorry.
That's okay. We're on Zoom after all.
I'm sorry about that. So this is something that we need to assess as moving forward, to what extent it's going to have an impact. One of the problems, I suspect, is that, oh my God. So one of the problems is that many Latin American societies have operated with this ideology of mestizaje. And the fact that, because they're hybrid cultures, because they're mestizo cultures, there is a tendency to see this problem as we've already overcome that. We're not racist here. I know coming from Puerto Rico, in Puerto Rico, people will not recognize racism, and it's flagrant. There is absolutely racism in Puerto Rico, but people don't recognize it. They don't recognize themselves as having, Black blood in their veins. They see themselves as white, and they won't absolutely recognize that. So there is that problem to overcome. And even Brazil considers itself a social democracy, a racial democracy, I'm sorry. But Afro-Brazilians, don't have the same status as, white Brazilians. And if you go to Sao Paulo today, even in middle class neighborhoods, there are service elevators for all the service people, for all the Blacks, so that is a very, very serious problem. And I don't think that our field, art history or museums have really dealt with that problem. There's hardly anything. There is more literature in terms of the colonial period, but not in terms of the contemporary. And it's very hard to identify who are the artists who are working, who are the Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Argentinians, Afro-Mexicans, what is happening with these artists, because nobody's addressing that topic, or has not addressed it until now. So this is very recent. I'm hoping that it will have some kind of impact and that we will see a shift in the field.
Thank you, Mari Carmen. I just wanted to point out for the record that Cisneros Institute at MoMA hosted 2 talks with Afro-Brazilian artists and curators hosted by Thomas Lax. And I attended just one of them, but someone from the guests in attendance said that to them, it was unthinkable, or it would have been even unthinkable a year ago, that MoMA would have had Rosana Paulino and Gianni Lima, who were the guests that day there, right, at this moment. So I think that this to me points to a rapid shift, and that has occurred literally within the last 6 months. And now my question is perhaps, how it will be sustained, and will—
Yes, but again, I'm sorry, it is a rapid shift, but it's happening at MoMA. It's happening in New York. It's happening in the United States. It's not happening in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. So, I'm not saying that these discussions don't happen there. I'm sure they do. And there is even a museum of, for Black Brazilian art. But usually, it relies on something that is coming from the United States and becomes the trend, and it becomes, what people need to follow. And then, that has an impact, but it's not generated, in the countries.
I would politely disagree. I think that these dynamics are quite complex between, I think, what the artists want to do sort of for on their levels, and sort of maybe harnessing on—
I'm not talking about the artists. I'm not talking about the artists. The artists definitely, yes, absolutely. And I'm talking about the institutional establishment. The artists definitely address it in their work. That's there. But whether it gets recognized, at the social level, and whether it has an impact to generate a debate at the local level, that's what I'm not sure.
Okay, great, thank you. I see that our chat is hot and popping with questions. I would like to see if any one of you would like to ask their question out loud. And indeed, I'm seeing a raised hand, so I will first pass on the microphone to Roberto Tejada.
Hola, Mari Carmen. Thank you for that. Hola. Thank you for that talk. I feel that I have about 5 different questions that, in a sense, we've already covered in our various conversations, but you're talk today made me think of two things. One is the economy of scale that the global contemporary suggests. And that led me to think of a model for accounting for that economy of scale, which is the economy of attention that the algorithms of social media put forward.
Mm-hmm.
Next to this, I want to think about the diasporic Latin America and the United States and Latinx art, and put these two ideas together in some sort of question, which is to what degree do we measure the success or efficacy of Latinx or Latin American art entering into the global contemporary? Is it through museums? Is it through the market? Is it through scholarship? It seems to me that all these things, I don't know if there's one particular answer for it, but from your perspective at the museum, I wonder how you see this.
Well, it's everything. It's in all of those realms. It's usually people point to the market as the emblem of success. If the work sells for $3 million, that means that that artist has made it and it's very successful. But I think it's a combination of things. It's the markets, is exhibitions at museums, at reputable museums or reputable galleries, is the extent to which important galleries take on these artists and shepherd them, through the whole process and mainstream them, establish them in the mainstream. And it's also the way that publications and research on these artists evolves. One of the problems that we had 20 years ago is that there was hardly anything circulating in English, or as many of you remember, Latin American art was not studied. Latin American art really, this construct that we call Latin American art is something that happened, that emerges here in the United States. And it first with MoMA and Alfred Barr, this notion of a field called Latin American art. And then in 1979, with the first auctions that specialized in Latin American art. But that was, in both cases, it was an artificial phenomenon because there was nothing to ground it. Collectors were not collecting it. The universities were not teaching it, and museums were not collecting it. It was something that was really almost, rootless. And what's happened in the last 20 years is that museums have begun to collect this art. Universities were the last ones to really come on board, with the exception of UT Austin. And there's been this concerted effort, to legitimize this art, to validate it, and to provide, the research base for it to become successful at the mainstream level. However, my point of view, a lot of people think that that's it, that, we've made it and, it's been resolved. I don't think so. I constantly battle with artists that I support, that I'm aware of, and these artists are not being considered. If you open up any textbook of 20th or 21st century art, there's hardly any artists from Latin America. Perhaps Lydia Clark, Elio Tisica, the ones who have made it big. But the contributions of these artists at the theoretical level, have not been yet accepted. And that's the reason behind the ICAA and the ICAA Documents Project, is to make available all of that, basis of information for people to understand what these artists were doing and how important they were, not just from the point of view of practicing their art, but in terms of contributing original theory to modernism and postmodernism. So all of these factors, need to be taken into consideration to determine, the success or not of this art. In the case of Latinx art, of course, that's a completely different phenomenon, and I could have addressed some of it in my talk, but I really feel that it merits its own separate space. And the issue with Latinx art is that the production is out there, the population that supports it is out there, but there is hardly any infrastructure, and no museums are collecting this art except for Houston actively and a few others. There is an academic establishment that lives in the English departments because art history does not, in general, accept it. And so, there's still a lot, that needs to happen with Latinx art for all of those pieces to fall into place. And there's hardly any collectors and hardly any market for this art. Things are beginning to change, undoubtedly, but there's still a terrible imbalance.
So maybe you know where I was going with this question, which is, wouldn't it be possible for Latin American institutions to flip the script whereby Latin American institutions can authorize and legitimate knowledge production if they also took into account, for example, Latinx art produced in the United States?
Yes, theoretically. Yeah, we would have to see if that, if that will happen. There are many, racism is a big issue. Classism is a big issue. And there are many barriers that need to be, broken down before that can actually happen. From my experience.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roberto. Cecilia Fajardo-Hill would also like to ask her
Hello.
question out loud.
Hi, Mari Carmen. So I wanted to ask you a question about the recent book by Arlene Davila, Latinx Art, Markets and Politics. I don't know if it just came out from Duke University.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, and I heard there was a review in a Hyperallergic, and there was a conversation between Adriana Zavala and herself at the Whitney Museum. And in both the article and in the conversation, it was stressed the idea that Latin American art has an infrastructure, a market, some sort of I don't know how to say it, sort of a popularity that is somehow one of the reasons why versus Latinx art, so Latinx art suffers because of it. So there is a need to sort of keep the fields, seems to be apart, because there was a conversation about the fact that they shouldn't be necessarily brought together, which I'm completely against. I think they need to be brought in dialogue. But also there was some sort of blaming into this idea that the success of Latin American art means the marginalization of Latinx. First of all, as you say, Latin American is a construct. And then also we know that this success needs to be put very much in inverted commas. And I feel that the core of the issue is the US, not Latin America. But I would like to know what you think about this.
Well, I think this is part of the growing pains of the field. As I said, I mean, Latin American art is a construct, that happens here in the U.S. and the U.S. empowers, this construct and turns it into a market phenomenon, like it or not. I mean, there are other factors involved, of course, but that's part of what happens. Latinx art has not had that same level of success. And because, it's an art that came out of the civil rights movement. It's art that is associated, with grassroots manifestations. It's a very political art. And it is, even if you compare Latinx art to what is happening with Black art. I mean, Black artists right now are fetching $30 million, in value, which they deserve. But it's very hard for Latinx artists to even, make it into a Manhattan living room, whereas Black artists have made it, in that sense. So it's still in growing pains. And I understand that what Arlene and Adriana are trying to do is to separate these two fields so that Latinx art can finally come into its own. I don't think that that's the way to do it, because I do think that we need to start looking at the affinities, and the differences between these fields. I mean, these two areas need to come together in a way that that has not happened yet. But I think I would say it's a political strategy at this point to separate them and to try to make them, to antagonize Latin American art, because wealthy people behind Latin American art, and you don't have the wealthy people behind Latinx art. And it's a way to, create that kind of straw man to help to ensure, that the field can come into its own. And I think it's predictable, and I think there's a certain value to that. But from our point of view at the ICAA and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, from the very beginning, when the program started in 2001, we took a hemispheric approach. We promote the fact that we have to look at these two groups together. And that is because over the last 20 years, what is called Latinx art has also changed dramatically. We're not looking just at the traditional communities of, Puerto Rican, Nuyorican, Chicanos, Cuban Americans, which were the original sort of like Latinx communities. Now, what is called Latinx community, anyone who comes from Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala is considered a Latinx artist. That has to do with other issues. It has to do with how diversity has been institutionalized in many cases. It's a separate problem. But the issue is that it's a far more complex community. In the 1960s, when Liliana Porter and Luis Kamnitzer came to New York, they were considered Argentinian artists who lived in New York, Latin Americans who lived in New York. They were foreign nationals. Now, an artist coming from Argentina is considered a Latinx artist. Whether that's fair or not, that's not the issue, but this is actually happening, and it requires that we develop different kinds of strategies to look at that phenomenon, which is an extremely complex phenomenon. I don't know if that answers, where's Cecilia, your question?
Cecilia, you're muted.
Sorry. I have a dog making noise in my house, sorry. No, I completely agree with you, but I mean, I don't want to take on the, oh, I'm muted. I'm muted?
No, we can hear you.
Yeah. So no, I completely agree with you, but I feel that, this, especially now that we talk a lot about this kind of political moment in the country that needs to come together, against issues of racism and classism and everything, it seems to be such an incredible opportunity also for bridging the gaps between, let's say, Latin America, Latinx, American art, African American art, Asian American art, so that to kind of create this sort of, and at the end of the day, the strategy that has always taken place in terms of any art of any kind is at the end, you become specific in your reading. So for me, the dangers of bringing everything together is exactly what has always happened with Latin American art. That is one single umbrella for everything. And we're always weeding out the differences and try to establish specificity. So I feel that, we've already done that. And I feel that, that to have to separate in order to identify Latinx art, I think is a missed opportunity, and also the same with American art. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, so much. Perhaps
I think there, just one last thing. I think there's one very important factor that needs to be taken into consideration. Latinx art is alive, because it is part of the demographic transformations of this country. And it is an unstoppable transformation. I mean, there's no matter how much the government wants to throw people out, that's not going to happen. It's only going to continue. So Latinx art has by far a far more relevance in this society than so-called Latin American art. I have, as a provocation, have said that I think Latin American art eventually is going to become sort of like a rarefied category, sort of like old masters, European old masters. It's going to be an academic, category rather than because it is Latinx art that has, the pulse, of this society right now. And that hasn't been recognized by people. I mean, they think I'm crazy when I say these things. So, it's something to bear in mind. And I would be very curious to see where we are in this field, 20 years from now.
Thank you, Mari Carmen. I think a lot of people would agree with you, actually. I would hope, at least in this group. We also have very live chat, so maybe I will turn to Sandra now to read some of the questions, excellent questions that we've received.
Sure. We have a question from Leticia Cobra Lima on the topic of the ready-made and everyday objects and materials. What are some of the specificities of such practices you perceive in Latin American art in relation to their European, US American incarnations? I think this relates to sort of what you were talking about.
Yes. Wow, that's a really broad question. Where do I start with that? I think the difference is that in Europe, and I don't want to overgeneralize because obviously we're trying to make these distinctions and then you end up, doing over generalizations that don't apply obviously in all cases. But I would say that in the case of European and American art, the ready-made has been appropriated mostly on formal terms. People, or at least the way that it's interpreted, tends to be on those terms. I mean, people look at Rauschenberg and they look at how radical he's, taking all these objects from trash become. They don't talk about the meaning, of those objects and how it alters, what he was trying to do in his context. And he himself would never talk about that, although that it's part of the intentionality. So we don't necessarily need to deal with that. But I think in Latin America, I've dealt, for instance, in contingent beauty, is when this became very clear. All of these artists, most of the artists that I show, and there were only about 35 works, major works in that show, but most of the artists were assembling ready-mades. I mean, they were assembling, most of the installations and the sculptures and structures were made out of accumulation of materials, like the starfish of Maria Fernanda Cardoso, the teeth of Joan Capote, Tania Bruguera. We had a flag that was made out of human hair, the hair of Cuban citizens and Cuban people. Oscar Munoz was dealing with sugar and coffee, which are the two staples of the Colombian economy. And in every case, they were bringing together those ready-mades, but they were in a context, that was denouncing some kind of violence, some kind of injustice, some bringing to light some history of the collectivity or the individual that had been repressed or suppressed in some way. So there is much more of a deliberateness, to that, which may be present in some European examples or American examples, but not as intentional and as marked and as intense as in the work of these artists. So that's what I meant when I talk about the distinctions between one and the other in relation to these to the ready-made.
I'd like to ask a question also from Jay Myers-Supinska, who I see on the screen. I don't know if you want to ask your question verbally, but I love how it touches on the theme of our entire series. You're
muted.
Am I?
He's muted.
Yeah, I'm anyways, trying to get you to unmute if you're, there you go, great.
Sure, it said you'd muted me. Sure, I can read the question. It's really about the category of the contemporary, the global contemporary as such, and trying to historicize it a little bit in terms of the present. So the category of the contemporary, as Terry Smith and others wrote about it, is linked intimately or critically with globalization itself. And yet in the last decade, the project of globalization has been traversing a major crisis, with right-wing and authoritarian anti-globalisms emerging all over the globe, with the possible effect that the category of the contemporary seems in danger of losing its defining condition, its defining political and economic condition. And so I wonder, how has the category of the contemporary, or the global contemporary itself changed as a result, if it has? Is it sort of in a vestigial relationship to a globalism that is in the process of transformation? Do we need to rethink the term? Should we be thinking about the post-contemporary? And is the construct of Latin American contemporary art at all useful for doing that job, thinking that way?
Thank you. It's absolutely true what you're saying, and obviously, globalization is a thing of the past. We're living in a completely different paradigm right now, which it's not maybe completely clear, but definitely there's been a resurgence of nationalisms, and we have to. I think it's too soon. We have to see, how that's going to change. But I think that as defined by Terry, the contemporary does not stand a chance, in this new paradigm. And whether we're going to want to call it the post-contemporary or another term is going to come up, I think it's certainly something that needs to be considered. But I think there's also a danger in adopting these terms as umbrella terms to define such complex phenomena. I understand, the need to do it, to try to make sense, of things that are happening, in the present time. But at the same time, I think that, the situation, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or China or Japan, I mean, it's the same that it was, at the beginning of the 20th century in many ways. I mean, endemic problems are there. And I think the focus should be on what can be done, to resolve, these problems, rather than cling, to this, umbrella category that's going to save us and update us and put us in fast forward mode, to be part of that. And that's part of the problem with these categories, that people buy into them, thinking that, that's gonna make them arrive at what they want, where the endemic problems and the chronic problems of these societies continue to be the same. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think definitely we're in a different paradigm, or we're entering a different paradigm.
Fantastic. We have a few more minutes.
And excuse me, let me just add to that. In Latin America, we're seeing there's something that I'm very interested in right now. I unfortunately, I haven't done enough research to share insights with you, but there is now this going back on the part of many contemporary artists to indigenous cultures, which to them, as I said before, it touches them more than the Black Lives Matter problematic. But it's a different way of going back to the indigenous past. They're drawing from the indigenous past as a kind of an alternate form of social structure and organization. It's not about the motifs. It's not about the easily recognizable, motifs of the Mayas or the Incas or, whomever. It has to do with ecological sustenance. It has to do with spirituality. It has to do with trying to overcome, the crisis of the present. So that, I think, is something that would be interesting to see whether it's happening in other places at the same time and what's going to come out of that. It may be just a particular movement, but as far as I can tell, it's happening not only in Mexico, but in Guatemala and in Peru and in many different places, and it would be interesting to see whether that's going to give rise, to a different paradigm.
Yes, this is great. Can I just add something to that, Mari Carmen? I really think that I agree. I agree with you that perhaps the most exciting work is the work of indigenous artists who are very much of the present and working in the present. And what comes with that, sort of the ultimate breaking boundary between so-called previously what was known as folk art and contemporary art, which exerts very interesting pressure on this notion of globalization. Anyways, do we have more questions? Would anybody ask to speak with us?
Danielle Stewart had a question in the chat. Several people brought up MASP.
Mask? Where is it?
Their efforts
Arte de Sao
with
Paulo.
racial and gender issues.
I didn't hear that.
Danielle Stewart brought up MASP, saying several young curators are dealing with a long history of Afro-Brazilian art.
Yes, that's true.
And
Yes.
would consider those exhibitions
Yes.
and how they deal with racial and gender issues.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that obviously there are exceptions to this, and they're doing it. They did such a good job with the exhibition on the African Atlantic that we're bringing it here to Houston. You're going to be able to see that show. I think it's coming next year, if everything this allows. But I do think that together with Malba, MASPI is an exception, within Latin America, and it's essentially also a private museum. It's a museum that we have an exchange. We have actually exchange agreements with both of them, and they are managed by independent boards and or private people, wealthy people. And they have been able to assemble a young team of curators who have a different view. And they're curators who have worked internationally, who bring international perspectives to what is happening in Brazil. And so, I mean, when I saw the Afro-Atlantic exhibition at MASPI, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I literally told my boss here in Houston, I mean, this would have been unthinkable in the United States. I mean, I don't know of anybody in the United States who could have done that exhibition. Why? Because they're not limited, by the same canons or the same narratives, that have prevailed about this art, and they're free to choose. There was even work by Biggers, who's a Houston artist who's not even sometimes appreciated the way that he should be in that exhibition. And they were amazing, amazing works. So the possibility to take art from all of the African Atlantic and put it in dialogue, with colonial art. There were dialogues between contemporary and colonial art. There were dialogues between Brazilian and African, or Black, English, British artists. I mean, it was just, an extremely refreshing exhibition. And I think it's an example of what can be done, when you have the talent and the resources, in many of these countries.
We have another question in the chat that I think would be a great question to end on. But Maximiliano Cervantes wants to know what advice you have for Latinx art students.
What advice? In what sense? For is it a student of art history or fine arts, or?
I don't know. But I guess anyone who's interested in pursuing this,
I think you should definitely pursue it. You should go head on into it, and you should try to learn as much as possible. Visit every single artist that you can find, because those artists are going to be making history in a few years. And even if they have been recognized or not, even if they're your local artists, you should pay attention to them, figure out, what they're doing, what they're trying to do, how they're different from others, and, assess, what their work is, and do that kind of field work, because that's what really needs to be done. I mean, there's a lot of field work that needs to happen. There's a lot of, gathering of archives and gathering of important publications and materials. The archives of Latinx artists are still under the bed or in the closet of the grandmothers. I mean, I know, because we face that with, the ICAA project was from the beginning about Latino and Latin American artists. And when we started trying to look for archives of Latino art, I mean, the universities had not collected them. There were no official archives, everything was like, in shoeboxes, underneath the beds. And that's what our field researchers, had to do, was go literally to the houses of the families of the artists, et cetera, to gather this information. So it's a brand new field. It's very exciting, and you should embrace it. I can tell for experience, because when I started off, You know, it was the same thing with Latin American art. And I've lived now, 35 years. I've seen it go from zero interest, to becoming this kind of global phenomenon. And that's what's made it, really very exciting to be in this field.
That is a really, really wonderful and generative thought to end on. Thank you so much, Mari Carmen. Thank you for imbuing
Thank you
us
to everyone for being here.
Enthusiasm to end this conversation. Thank you so much for your tremendous generosity. Just to remind everyone that Mari Carmen is on the end of installing the new kinder building, and the vast majority of the collection that she has built here in Houston over the course of the past 20 years is finally going to have its dedicated space physically in the museum. So I hope that also inspires everyone to come visit us physically whenever that's possible. Thank you so much again. Thank you all for joining us. Our next speaker is Leah Dickerman from the Museum of Modern Art. Very soon, this coming Thursday, October 15th at 2:30 p.m. You can still register, and you can still register for the talks by Atri Gupta and our Global Roundtable. So we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. And please come visit us at the kinder after November 21st, but be safe first.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.